Okay. Cool. Hi guys, thank you for coming. We are here on this is E105. We got some interesting talks going on today. Right now we have Patrick here. He's going to be talking about centralized authentication. Patrick has been working for Red Hat for 1 year and 8 months under the Fedora project, right?
Yeah.
And so, here's to them.
Good morning. I've been asked to present about my experiences at deploying centralized authentication at Fedora infrastructure, as that I've been working on that for a little over 2 years now. So, first of all, I've been asked to present something, but my presentation is marked as a workshop. Is there anyone here who had expected to come to a workshop, actually, or... Okay, because I mean, I could do whatever. So, the problem we were trying to tackle is we were running a open source project, the Fedora project in my case, where we run a wiki instance. Well, we have a bug tracker. You might have a code review in your own project. You might have translation management. And of course, all of these software packages come from different vendors and as such have a different authentication system. So that means that every user that wants to contribute to your project would need to register again for every service they use. For example, I don't know if any of you saw this. Both of these registration screens are for the same project, and it becomes even more fun. So, let's say I want to contribute to a project. Well, I first need to file a bug, so I register for the bug tracker, and well, I register as username Patrick, and with password being password, because I'm not that security oriented, for example. Then I want to submit a code patch, but it turned out that the user Patrick has already been taken for that system, and well, now I have to take something different. Let's just take my first initial and my last name, like probably a lot of you do. Next up, I want to submit translations for my patch because, that was asked during review. And then, well, apparently that system requires a more strict password, so I'll just add the numbers 1 and 2 after my password. Which, by the way, never do this password. This is just an example. So, a month later, I get an email from the bug code review tool saying, hey, someone reviewed your patch, and he has some comments, and he asks you to update the patch. Well, okay, you go to the patch tool and the code review tool, and you try to log in. What password did I use for this service, and what username? Let's hit the forgot password button. Oh wait, what email address did I use again? So basically, the problem is, for every service of this one project, I've got a different username and password, and they're probably not the same everywhere. I mean, I've had this for some projects which I tried to contribute to, and, well, it hurt. I wonder how many of you have hit this problem, because I've hit it several times during several projects. So, what we did in Fedora was we centralized our authentication system, because this is not a nice way to invite contributors to your project. So what we did is we wrote the Fedora account system, because that's history, and I think at that point in time there was no free IP available yet. And all of our applications contacted the Fedora account system. So every single time the user registered on the FAST system, which is a plus, but then every single application needs to contact that single authentication source every single time the user wants to log in, which might not sound like a big problem until you also have to verify between requests if the user is still valid, because, well, the Fedora account system did all the session tracking, even for remote applications. And if you go this route, your project will need to always have its own authentication stack, even if you only have like a code review tool and nothing else. You still need an entire authentication stack. So, as Simo said yesterday, I mean, have any of you seen Simo Source's talk yesterday? Okay, that's not a lot of people. So, Federation is the way we went in Fedora, because basically you have a remote authentication system which your application doesn't contact directly, but it contacts through other well-known protocols to authenticate the user with. So, oh wow, that's a funny one. So, for those of you who can read upside down, that's an interesting one, actually. LibreOffice just died, or whatever. So, with Federation, the application, in this case a wiki instance, would not contact the identity management provider directly. It would contact the identity provider, which okay, that's interesting. So okay. So apparently we locked the room when we closed the door. Oh wow. So, for those who just entered, who expected a workshop? Because I got apparently scheduled for a workshop, and that was not my idea. Did anyone expect one? Okay. So, I'll just continue then. With Federation, which is what we use for Fedora, the application doesn't contact identity management like Fedora account system in our case directly. Instead, it redirects you to the identity provider, which then authenticates you against the identity management tool. So, because a major advantage of this is that the identity management tool doesn't have to be publicly available. So we have a web interface for the Fedora account system, but the actual authentication part is not publicly available, so that brute force attacks, for example, are harder to mount. So with Federation, the application redirects you to the identity provider, which then authenticates you, issues a claim, which the application you get redirected back to then accepts as valid and just takes your identity from that. So, in order to actually use a federating infrastructure, you need to set up 4 things if you want to control your own users. You need an identity management infrastructure, so IPA or Fedora account system or whatever else you would like to use. As most of you probably know, in Fedora we use the Fedora account system. You need an identity provider which supports federation protocols. So Epsilon is a project I've been working on. Picket Link is something we have, and there's a lot of others. Just Google for identity provider. You probably also need users. I mean, how else are you going to authenticate people if you don't have users? And you need to maintain applications that actually use your identity stack. But if you're a small project, and you don't care about authentication or whatever, you don't actually need all of this. If you're a very small project, you could also just use the applications you like, for example, wiki, and have the authentication and everything done remotely at other parties. And actually, for small projects, I think this might be best because you have way less infrastructure to manage and way less chance of critical security issues because of password attacks or something like that. So, 2 stacks that I maintain with the software I prefer to use personally. The identity management system, for Fedora we use the Fedora account system, though we're still talking about moving that to IPA in due time. We use FedOauth, which is an identity provider I wrote a long time ago, and we're moving to Epsilon. And internally we use OpenID and Persona. Have any of you ever seen this? So, for those who don't know, have any of you seen this ever? because this is the Fedora identity provider that we use. So for pretty much every Fedora contributor will have seen this probably. So in GNOME we use IPA with Fedora Auth as well. We're planning on migrating to Ypsilon in due time because that's the new version. We haven't had time for that yet. The protocol we're using there is just OpenID. So, just so you notice, we use the same identity provider, but different identity management solutions. So, it doesn't matter too much what you use to actually store your users for this. As long as the provider can talk to it, it should work just fine. And given that OpenID and Persona are open protocols, I think they're a safe choice to use for open source projects for centralizing your authentication infrastructure. So, what would you need to actually set up federated authentication? Well, first you need identity management. I mean, if you don't have anything you could authenticate against, it's going to be difficult. Then you need to migrate your users to use that, which can be quite tricky if you already have a current stack, like if you already have a wiki and bug tracking tool and other things that have their own user accounts. Migrating all users to the identity management to a central system is going to be hard. So my advice, start with a central system as soon as you start an open source project, or at least think about it as soon as you implement a second application. If you have two applications, it already becomes very annoying because you get users with different usernames at the same services or at different services, and migrating is very tricky. I know, I speak from experience there. We use that at GNOME. After you set up an identity management system, set up the identity provider. I would advise against using the identity management system directly for your applications, because you might be tempted to not consider setting up an identity provider later on. So you get stuck basically into the single protocol that your identity management solution supports, like LDAP or FAS. And from experience, every application has a limited set of identity management systems it supports. So being stuck with just one isn't going to work well if you want to deploy more applications later on. Then you will need to configure your applications to use the identity provider you set up. And after that, well, only if you add new applications, you need to configure them, but for the rest, it should continue to work. So, as I said, for setting up an identity provider, so that's not the identity management, but the part that translates or that authenticates users against identity management and then issues a claim to the applications, I would suggest you to not care about its direct implementation, as long as it can talk to your identity management system and the protocols you're going to use. I would suggest at least trying to support OpenID, because that's what most open source projects support, and most applications that you will likely deploy will support OpenID authentication. SAML 2, not sure, because that's more for enterprises. So, as I said, the protocols, Persona is mostly used for remote stacks because it only authenticates with the email address and doesn't send any additional information. It's not so useful for your own infrastructure because you will need to have every application maintain a list of groups and name and email address for the user. Well, not email address, but name and other information. SAML 2 is usable, but as I said, it's mostly for enterprises because you need a thorough setup and it requires a contract between each application and identity provider. So if you're going to run a small open source project and you don't want to use your own, you don't want to run your own identity management and use another project's authentication infrastructure, that's not going to work with SAML because you will need a contract with the identity manager you're going to use. OpenID is the one I would personally suggest to use for new deployments because it supports exchanging data, and also you can make it work, or people can also use it at remote sites. For example, the Gluster Garrett instance, maybe anyone submitted there, but they let you log in with OpenID where you can enter any identity you like. So a lot of people, you log in with their Fedora account at the Gluster Garrett instance.
What is an example of a local stack?
Of what?
Local stack?
Well, sorry, I should have explained that. With local stack, I mean if you run your own authentication provider, if you run the entire stack, so you have your own identity management, your own users, and your own identity provider. So, for example, in Fedora, we run everything ourselves. We have a Fedora account system where you register a username and password. We have the identity provider with which you can log in through OpenID to other sites. A remote stack would be, for example, what Gluster has for their Garrett instance. They don't have an authentication system for their Garrett instance. They delegate that to other people. So
when you only do remote stack, how do you propose the administration to be done? I mean, yes, I allow remote users to come in.
right.
But I also want to be able to log in myself. There's usually at least one local user there.
Right. So for that, you could just say that you set up your own OpenID provider. For example, at the Gluster Garrett, they use the Fedora OpenID server, and the admins just have their own users configured for. If you log in with this OpenID URL, because every user will get its own identity, you get admin access. So they trust
Okay,
it.
so they get the authentication external, but
Yes.
authorization is somehow added internally.
Yes. Authorization is mostly,
Gotcha.
and obviously this. Sorry? So, yeah. So as I said, I would personally suggest that if you're going to deploy a new stack, you would try to support as many of the protocols, but try to support at least OpenID, as that's supported in most of the applications you're likely going to use, like wiki, Garrett, and most of the others. Note that OpenID itself, the protocol, has been deprecated by upstream but it is still used by many applications. And it doesn't conflict with any of the others, so if you have an identity provider that supports more protocols, I would suggest to use that. So, after you selected the identity provider, you will need to configure your applications. You basically have three types of applications here, ranging from very easy to use with federated authentication to very difficult. Either it's already built into the application and you just need to configure it, for example for Garrett, which is very easy to do. Either there might be a plugin available, for example that's the case with MediaWiki. It's not built into the core, but there's a plugin available. Or you need to extend the application and add support for any of the protocols you're using. If you still need to decide on what you use, so for example you're trying to determine between MediaWiki and pwiki, try to use the one that has either support built in or has a plugin available, so that it becomes easier for you to use it. If there's no other way, you can always use the remote user way, where you have the authentication handled by Apache with, for example, mod Melon, of which the author is sitting in the back, Simo, or mod OpenID. So, for what we did at Fedora, because I set up this for Fedora some of our applications were written in Flask, which is a web framework, and we're using Flask Fast, which was our own extension that supports, that authenticated directly against the Fedora account system. There it was very easy because, well, I had to write a replacement, but that was pretty easy. Other frameworks also have OpenID clients available. Flask Fast OpenID, for example, if you use Flask, okay, that should have been Flask OpenID, because there's a Flask OpenID plugin which makes OpenID in Flask applications very easy. There's val rules for most other Python applications you want to extend. And all of the other applications we have been more work. So my point here is trying to say, be careful if you already have applications, because migrating to a federated setup is going to be very tricky. Don't underestimate it. If you already have everything deployed, it's going to be difficult to migrate users and to migrate applications if you didn't use it from the start. So my advice is, when you start an open source project, try to start using it centralized authentication directly, instead of saying, well, we'll look into that later on. So, as I said, remote stack, if you don't want to maintain any users, well, you can either just say, we always use the same identity provider. For example, there's some projects that say, whenever you hit login, we just redirect you to Fedora login. Well, feel free to do that if you don't want to maintain any users. If you want to be vendor neutral or identity neutral, have users enter their own OpenID identity. That's, for example, used at Gluster Garrett. So, if you're going to use OpenID, I would suggest to look into some extensions that you might want to use. There's simple registration and attribute exchange, which do mostly the same, except that simple registration is much more limited in the data it provides. The Teams one is actually one that might be very useful if you run your own stack, because then you can also have centralized group management. For example, what we do in Fedora account system, we have all of our groups managed by Fedora account system, and the Teams extension is used to provide the groups to applications that use our provider to make decisions on whether or not they allow certain operations based on the set of groups you have. So as I was saying earlier, you can either just configure groups locally, which is what you should do if you don't run your own authentication stack. If you do, you should centralize the groups, because that makes group management and permission management a lot easier. And for that, you should use the Teams extension. So, conclusions. Implementing it is afterwards, after you already have an open source project, after you already have contributors, is going to be very hard. Think about it before you start deploying your first application, and at least before you start deploying your second application, because merging users is hell. If you don't, then try to get support as early as possible. So if you actually started it, try using an identity provider that supports as many protocols as you probably need, since adding more protocols is often most protocols are not competing with each other, as in they can run safely side by side. So we run OpenID, Persona, and SAML all side by side, and applications can use whatever they want in Fedora. So whatever you do, you will need to do some development. So make sure you have at least some development available, or at least administration to get it up and running. Don't underestimate how difficult this is, and that's experience speaking. I've had 2 stacks. So, are there any questions to this? Guess not. We're still not entirely finished. I've been working on it for 2 years now, but we're still trying to migrate 2 applications, which are still using fast directly, because they didn't support the OpenID or any of the protocols. They only supported local authentication, which are a very old version of MediaWiki and Bodhi, so our update management tool. If that's all, then thank you for your attention. never thought about submitting this talk myself. I had been asked by the organization. Otherwise, I would have been here as an attendee.
Yeah. Thanks. Are you gonna go see some of the talks now?
Sorry?
Are you gonna see some of the talks now?
I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure.
Are you staying here for a while?
Until Monday?
Hope you enjoy.
Sorry?
Hope you enjoy. First time?
No, my third or fourth?
Were you here last year for a little bit?
Yes. And for Flock, I was in Prague, but before that we had meetings in Brno. And I think I was at DevConf the year before as well.
We can check that off to see basically. And I want versus
So it's just building something, so just leave it. I just use the washroom quickly and I'll be right back.
Steel or sparking? Steel or sparking?
Oh, water? Oh, whatever. Thank you. I'll have to pay you when I get it. No.
Pauze.
Okay.
Hallo?
Já jsem tam hodil pauzu, takže...
Proti malý český.
You need to speak close to the mic.